Before you do a hair analysis, you have to understand that it matters where you have your hair analysis done and who you choose to do a hair analysis with. So in this video, I want to talk about 3 factors for successful hair analysis. So let's quickly go through the 3 factors. Number 1 is choosing the right laboratory. Number 2 is choosing a practitioner and understanding the interpretation method that they use. And number 3 is understanding the program that's going to be offered based on your test results. So let's start with number 1. The first factor for successful hair analysis is the laboratory used for the analysis. In the United States and around the world, there are probably a few dozen hair analysis laboratories. And each of them have a somewhat different procedure for testing the hair samples at the lab. Now, most of the labs use ICP mass spectrometers, which are very advanced and reliable devices for measuring minerals in the hair. But the differences come in when we talk about the procedure for preparing the hair sample for analysis. And the differences between labs are that some labs use detergents to wash the hair sample before they test it. And out of the labs that use detergents, each of them use a different type of detergent for the most part. Some use the same one. And sometimes the duration that the hair sample is washed varies from lab to lab. So one lab may wash it for 5 minutes, another lab may wash it for 10 minutes. And all of these factors, the washing of the hair sample at the lab, the different times and durations of washing the hair sample at the lab, and the different chemicals used to wash the hair sample at the lab, all have been shown to affect the results. And the reason for this is because hair is actually somewhat porous. And by washing the hair sample with harsh chemicals, harsh detergents, and for long periods of time, is going to actually wash out some of the water-soluble elements from the hair sample. And it seems like at least some of the labs who do wash the hair sample at the lab, they know that it affects the water-soluble elements, but it's not a big deal to them because it does not affect the levels of toxic metals in the hair or heavy metals. These are not affected by washing the hair sample, and in their view, they're doing the test, they're offering the test mainly to detect toxic metals. And so they're really not concerned about the sodium or potassium levels. They don't see any relevance in those levels. So I think that's one reason why they continue to wash the hair, even though it affects the sodium and potassium levels. But in my view, the levels of sodium and potassium, those water-soluble elements, are critical for the interpretation of the test. And that's going to bring us to the next point, which is that once you get the test results back from the lab, it has to be interpreted. You have to gain meaning from what the numbers are saying. And each practitioner and each laboratory really has a different interpretation of the test. Some laboratories and practitioners are just concerned about the toxic metal section and what toxic metals are showing up in the hair. And if something's high, then they may take measures to address that. But a more effective and useful way to interpret the test is based on a system called metabolic typing. And metabolic typing is a way to classify people or bodies, really, based on biochemical or other differences. And there are several more ancient forms of metabolic typing or body typing, from acupuncture, which you have yin and yang. You have Ayurveda, which had pitta, vata, and kapha. There was Hippocrates, even had a system of classifying people. And so this is not really a new idea, but in the 1970s and 80s, Dr. Paul Eck was able to apply metabolic typing to a hair analysis. And Dr. Eck was interested in hair analysis early on when it became commercially available, but it was hard to gain meaning about what the mineral levels meant. He found out early on that it wasn't that if a mineral is low, that person is necessarily low in that mineral. And so he developed this whole system, and it was really based on metabolic typing and Hans Selye's stress theory of disease, George Watson's oxidation types, and he applied these to a hair analysis. So this is the second factor that really matters when you're choosing someone to do a hair analysis with, is that what is their interpretation method? Are they using it for metabolic typing? Are they using it as a whole systems analysis? And are they using Dr. Paul Eck's system that he developed and refined over a few decades? The third factor for successful hair analysis is once you have good test results and you have a good interpretation of the test results, what is the recommendations? It's not going to be helpful if those two things are right and then the person doing the hair analysis says, okay, well, you need this drug or you need just this remedy. That's going to be a very superficial approach, and I wouldn't want to work with somebody who uses that type of approach. And so you want to understand to some degree the principles of the program that's going to be offered. Is it going to be a holistic approach where the practitioner is going to help you with diet, maybe supplements, lifestyle factors based on your test results? Or is it going to be something that's more superficial? And what you're going to want to look for in this is kind of tying back to the interpretation method, is that the person understands metabolic typing, and then they're going to make recommendations based on your metabolic type. And that's really what's going to help push your body back into balance. So here are my recommendations for each of those factors. Number one is the laboratory. And so we want to look for a laboratory that does not wash the hair sample at the lab. That's most important. And there are actually only two labs that do not wash the hair sample at the lab, so it makes your choice somewhat easy. You have Analytical Research Labs in Phoenix, Arizona, and you have Trace Elements Incorporated in Dallas, Texas, or somewhere in Texas. I think it's Dallas. So those are going to be your best bets. You have to ask or find out before you do a hair analysis with a practitioner what lab they use. Make sure they're using one of those labs. In terms of the interpretation, those two labs have different interpretation methods. It's similar. They both do metabolic typing, and they both have a somewhat good understanding of hair analysis. However, between the two, I lean towards Analytical Research Labs for a few reasons. Number one is that they recognize a 4 lows pattern. So this is a little more technical, but it's one of the patterns that we find on a hair analysis that is extremely important. And Trace Elements does not recognize this pattern. And that's important because that pattern needs a specific approach for correction. And so without having that knowledge, they're not going to be able to, a practitioner using Trace Elements, if they're not familiar with that pattern, they're not going to be able to help. Number two is Analytical Research Labs has a much better graph. Both labs have a visually appealing graph of your test results, but Analytical Research Labs is based on ideal mineral levels. And so it's much easier to see certain patterns. And this includes the 4 lows pattern that I was just talking about. And to me, that makes a big difference, especially from a practitioner standpoint and interpreting the test. It really helps to have the graph set up the way that Analytical Research Labs has it. The third reason is that Analytical Research Labs offers far superior reports about the test results. So this is the interpretation of the test, and without question, Analytical Research Labs, their reports are extremely detailed. They're about sometimes over 40 pages, whereas Trace Elements only has a few pages and it's really not very informative. I also offer my own report, so a practitioner report, in addition to the laboratory report, but A lot of people really like the laboratory report. It covers a lot more stuff. It's very informative. And I would say doing a hair analysis with analytical research labs is beneficial just for that. One of the drawbacks of analytical research labs versus trace elements is that trace elements measures more toxic metals. They have a dozen or more toxic metals that they read on the test. And that can be helpful in some situations, especially if you're just looking for toxic metals. But in practice, it really doesn't matter much. And that's because if you're working with somebody who's setting up programs properly, they're going to be able to put you on a program that removes all of the toxic metals without having to focus on them. So, in other words, by taking a whole systems approach with the program, we're going to be able to increase the elimination of all of the toxic metals. We never want to focus on a single toxic metal in the first place, and so it's not essential to have all of those toxic metals measured. I wish analytical research labs would measure more toxic metals just because it would be more interesting and more fun, more informative, but on a practical level, it's not necessary. So for a laboratory, I lean towards analytical research labs for sure. And when it comes to the interpretation method, if somebody's using analytical research labs, they are likely familiar with the proper interpretation of the test. This goes the same thing for trace elements, but even though they have a slightly different interpretation, if somebody's using analytical research labs, they're probably versed in the proper interpretation method. Now, I have found this not to be true with doctors or chiropractors in particular, who may not have done training in hair analysis interpretation and just set up an account with the laboratory just to run tests for their clients. They may not have done training for hair analysis. So you still have to inquire about their experience or their training with hair analysis, and if they really understand Dr. X interpretation system. Now, the third is the program. And once you get those two things down, there's going to be a good chance that this person is going to offer a pretty decent program. If they have the lab down, if they have the interpretation down, and it sounds like they know how to interpret the test, they know what they're talking about when they get a hair analysis back, then their program is probably going to be pretty decent. And this is going to vary from practitioner to practitioner, unless that practitioner is just using the programs generated by the laboratory. So in many cases, analytical research labs will generate a program, a supplement and diet program based on a person's test results, and then the practitioner can pass those on to you. Now, in my case, when I do hair tests on people, I use the Analytical Research Lab's computer-generated program as a guide, but I also add the human touch. So this is going to come from information I've gained about the client, through their intake forms, and also based on my experience. I've been doing hair analysis for over 8 years, and so I have significant experience working with people, with the hair analysis, putting them on the program, adjusting the program as needed. And so that's something you also want to look for, is that a person has experience working with people and they're able to adjust the program as needed. So I know hair analysis seems like it's becoming more popular, and I hope this video helps to kind of give you an idea of what you should be looking for when you go online or go to your naturopath or functional medicine doctor. Hopefully this gives you some information about what to look for and how to filter out those who may offer the test but may not understand it well enough.